Hello. In this video, we will talk about personality traits and how personality traits relate to leadership. You see, everyone likes to be a leader, or at least most people do. No one likes to be just a follower, right? But do you have it in you to be a leader? Do you have the kind of personality traits that leaders have? Those are some of the questions that people who aspire to be leaders may have in their mind, either at a conscious level or at a subconscious level. But those are some of the questions that all aspiring leaders have. So this is a very important question, and the answers to these questions are even more exciting, even more enlightening. So in this video, actually this is going to be a two-part series of videos, because leadership and its connection with personality traits, it's a huge topic. Personality traits is the oldest area of research in leadership. Over close to 1.5 centuries of work that has been done on personality traits and its connection with leadership. So there's a lot of ground to cover. In the first part of the video, I will share some of the research that was done in the, say, until the 1950s, 1960s. And in my second part of the video, I will share some of the newer research that has been done in the area. The Big Five personality factor model and the Hexaco model, some of those personality traits model is what I will share in my second part of the video. By the way, this does not mean what I'm going to share in the first part of the video is redundant, but what I will be sharing has its root in the initial part of the 20th century. These things which I will be talking about continues to be researched, and the results of those research confirm what we know from the 1950s, 60s, or for that matter even the 70s. So this is still a very important video, and I think you will gain some interesting insights here. But before we make the connection between personality traits and leadership, we need to have clarity about what do we exactly mean by personality traits. We now already have clarity about what leadership means. We have, couple of videos devoted to that particular topic. But do we have clarity about what personality traits are? So that's the first question we will ask and we will answer. I think it's going to be easier to understand personality traits if we contrast it with something different and yet similar in certain ways. I'm talking about moods here. In this graph, what do we see? We see that our moods vary by the time of the day. This is from a study conducted by Watson, published in 2000. And we have data here about the moods of different people between 9 a.m. and midnight, right? And what do we see here? We see that positive affect or positive mood is lowest in the morning at 9 a.m. As the day progresses, the positive mood seems to get better, and that's an initially steep increase until noon, and then it flattens a little bit, but the positive mood on an average seems to be highest at 3 p.m. And after that peak, it slightly declines, and after 9 p.m. there's a big dip in the positive mood. In contrast, what do we see for the negative mood? In contrast, for the negative mood, we see that, well, in the morning we seem to be the most negative, and then there's a decline by noon, and then it pretty much stays the same for the rest of the day. Now, these are just averages for the population studied, right? There will be individual differences. The pattern that we see here may not necessarily apply to you. It doesn't apply to me for sure. Um, my mood, for example, is very high in the morning. A positive mood is very high. Uh, so I would be somewhere here. My positive affect is very high. In fact, as the day progresses, my positive affect, I think, starts declining. Um, but I start out with a high because of certain habits that I have, like meditation and going for running, and those activities give me a real high. I'm a morning person, and so there are individual differences, right? Um, but this is the overall pattern for the population that was studied. Now let's take a look at the next graph. In this next graph, again, we see that moods vary by the time, by the day of the week, right? It's from the same study. And we see that positive affect or positive mood is lowest on Sundays because we are dreading the Mondays, right? And then as the week progresses, our positive affect kind of gets better. Um, but as we come closer to the weekend, we start feeling really happy, and we are the most happy on Saturday. The negative mood almost takes a opposite pattern. Uh, we are least or uh, most negative on Sunday because again we are dreading the Monday, the work week. But as the week progresses, our negative affect kind of declines, and we are least unhappy on Saturday, pretty much similar to Friday. So what do these graphs tell us? It tells us that our moods change. They are not fixed. In contrast to moods, our emotions change even faster, right? What do I mean by that? Right now, I'm recording this lecture and I'm in a good mood. But imagine I receive a phone call from my family and somebody is very sick. Uh, that could suddenly change my emotions. If the person is very sick, I may start worrying, and um, so my emotions make a sudden change. Moods, in contrast, tend to be a little bit more stable. So while our emotions can fluctuate depending on what stimulus we encounter, our moods tend to be more stable, relatively more stable, right? Our moods may last for few hours. If we are in a sad mood, that may last for few hours or maybe even few days. Occasionally, it may last for over a week or two, right? Um, in contrast, our emotions, they change, much frequently. I receive a happy news and I'm suddenly very happy. I suddenly, somebody says something nasty towards me and I get really agitated, really angry. So emotions can change much faster, but moods tend to be more stable. So this is, I think, a good ground to contrast with personality traits. When we are talking about personality traits, we are talking about similar things. Like, one of the components of personality traits is it's our tendency to feel certain kind of emotions. But when we are talking about emotions there, or the kind of affect that we may be prone to feeling, in contrast to emotions and moods, personality traits tend to be extremely stable. Our personality traits don't change by the time of the day, by the day of the week, or for that matter, by the month of the year. Our personality traits tend to be very stable. Okay. Not that they cannot change at all. They do change, and that is something that I will touch upon later. But relative to moods, relative to emotions, they tend to be extremely stable. So the your friend from, say, your high school, you meet him or her after 20 years, you may get the feeling that this person hasn't changed at all. He's looks like the, not just physically. Physically, the person may have changed, but psychologically, he seems to be the same person. So what is it that has stayed same? That's what we are referring to here. We are referring to traits, those personality traits that tend to be so stable that it gives people a distinctive identity, right? So that is how we define personality traits actually. In the next slide, I will go to the definition of personality traits. So people tend to follow some consistent pattern in the way they tend to think, in the way they tend to feel, in the way they tend to behave. That consistency gives people their distinctive identity. In other words, you can differentiate between people based on these patterns that you observe in them. So we see meaningful differences between one person and another based on these distinctive patterns. Now, there are many ways that we can go about finding these individual differences. Physical attributes, for example, somebody may be extremely tall, somebody may be extremely short, and somebody may be of average height, somebody may be very muscular, another person may be skinny. But these attributes give people them their identities, right? Their hair color, the color of their eyes, all these factors do contribute to people's identities. And they tend to be very stable, right? Our heights, our don't change dramatically after we have gained adulthood, right? Similar kind of concept here. When we are talking about personality traits, the way we define it is that it's distinctive and relatively enduring ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. So we are not talking about physical attributes here like height, skin color, and so on and so forth. We are talking about attributes in terms of the way we tend to think, the way we tend to feel, the way we tend to act. But if these patterns tend to be enduring, in other words, if they tend to be so stable that they give people some kind of uniqueness, some kind of distinctive identity, that's what then we call as personality traits. Now, let me explain the same definition visually. Why? Because we are visual creatures and it becomes easier to understand difficult constructs if we represent them visually. So here we have a graph, a hypothetical graph. So on the x-axis we have time, say in months, but it could be years, doesn't matter. So each of these units, let's say, equates 1 month, okay, or yeah, 1 month. So we have 10 or 12 months here, depending on how many units we have. And on the y-axis, we have our emotional state. So 0 would mean we are neither feeling positive nor feeling negative. The higher up we go, we are feeling more positive. We are very happy. If we are going downwards, we are feeling negative. We are unhappy. Let's say that's the overall stage. Now, our emotions, our moods can certainly vary, as we have seen in the previous graphs from Watson's paper. So on a day-to-day basis, our emotions, our moods are varying, right? This is how it may look like an ECG, whatever, but we see that it's varying. It's not exactly the same. You get the idea, right? But what do we see here? So this could be the pattern of one person. Let's say, let me draw that of another person. Let me pick another color. Let's say purple. Another person may have a pattern something like this. Again, we see that the person's emotional state is changing. It's fluctuating. It's not always staying the same. Let me draw one more person. Okay, that's enough. So, as the months progress, we do see that the emotional state of different people are changing. But we also see something different. We see that this person's emotional state, the person in red, it does vary, but it stays within a certain range, right? The person is, yes, sometimes the person is less happy than other times, but it mostly fluctuates within a range. So generally this person is way more happy than this person in purple, let's say, right? This person is usually unhappy, right? So the emotional state of this person changes as well, but overall we see a pattern. We see that this person is generally unhappy. This person in green, we see that this person's emotions changes as well, but sometimes this person is happy, sometimes unhappy, but even there we see that this person has a range. It fluctuates within a certain range. That's range is pretty much staying stable over the months and maybe even years. And that's what we are referring to as personality traits. So now you see this red person is very different from the green person, is very different from the purple person, right? So they, based on the tendency to feel positive or negative emotions, we see three different people here, each with a distinctive identity. The red person is usually very happy-go-lucky person. The green person is mostly neutral, sometimes a little happy, sometimes a little less happy or sad, but mostly stays neutral, whereas the person in purple mostly in a negative mood, sometimes a little less negative than others. You get the idea, right? And this, even though we are seeing changes on a day-to-day basis, uh, because we see a consistency over a long period of time, we and that stability gives people that distinctive identity, and that's what we call our traits or personality traits. Now that you understand what personality traits are, the next question is, what personality traits do you have? That's probably what you are interested in, right? Anyone would be interested in that question now that we understand what personality traits are. And typically, how do you go about finding your personality traits? You take a personality test. Now, is this a good example of a personality test? We have 9 different figures here, and you have to pick one based on your preference. And that should give us some indication about the kind of personality you have. You see such tests on the internet, right? It's actually BS. These are not tests that you can trust. What does different color designs have to do with my personality traits? Nothing. Uh, they may give preference to certain colors that I may have, but it is not really a test of personality. But we see many such tests. In fact, if we go on the internet, there may be hundreds or even thousands of tests offered from different websites. Some charge you a substantial amount of money. to give you your test profile. And many of these tests are supposed to be meant for fun, right? You may see some of your friends taking tests and sharing those results on social media. What personality, what month of the year are you? What superhero are you? And so on and so forth. You may have taken some of those tests yourself. Uh, but are these real personality tests? And if they are, can we trust those results? That's the question that we have to ask. And as I indicated, we cannot trust these results. There are standardized tests of personality, and when we take only those standardized tests, can we be sure that the results that we are getting from it can be trusted? But there are two important concepts that come into play here. And those two concepts are reliability and validity. Anytime you are taking any test, you always have to ask these two questions. Is this test reliable? Is this test valid? Only when the test is both reliable and valid can we trust the results of that test. Now, this is a little, complex subject. One can delve pretty deep into these terms. This is part of research methodology, but at a very simple, broad level, what do we mean by reliability and validity? Reliability refers to the consistency in the results that we observe from a test. Consistency over time, consistency in different conditions. Now, and it applies to any instrument. It doesn't have to be just personality tests or intelligence tests or any psychological test. It can apply to anything, even physical instruments. Let's say I want to measure the length of my laptop. Okay, how do I measure it? I would take a ruler or a measurement tape and then measure the length of my laptop. Let's say I can't find a ruler. I don't have a ruler at home. And I find this rubber band. Oh, this is a great tool to measure the length of my laptop. And I use this to measure the length of my laptop. That's problematic, right? Because it is stretching. Even if it had those markings of centimeters or inches, I will get different results depending on how much I stretch, right? Sometimes I may get 11 inches, sometimes I may get 13 inches. Now it is fluctuating. So it will not be something that I can rely on. Now, again, this does not mean that the length of metals don't change. They do change, right? But within the room temperature, we should not see any major changes in the length of my laptop, right? But we are seeing such results when I'm using, unreliable tools like a stretchable rubber band. But if I use reliable tools like a proper ruler made out of plastic or some metal, then I can rely on those results. Same thing applies to personality tests. If I take a personality test today and I get a set result that I have whatever XYZ personality, and a month from now when I retake the test, do I get the exact same result? Within some variation, minor variation, because there can always be some error in test, little bit of error that is acceptable. Or am I getting dramatically different results? Today I took the test, I had XYZ personality. When I take it from month now, I do not have XYZ personality. I have, say, ABC personality. I'm just giving these arbitrary letters as indications of different personality traits. But then it is something that I cannot rely upon, right? Why? Because we know that personality traits by definition are stable. We should not see such dramatic changes within a month or couple of months. Does not mean that personality traits do not change. They do change, but the changes are very slow and of course never dramatic. They happen over a long periods of time. So if we see such dramatic differences, then we cannot rely on the results of those tests. So that is reliability. The next is validity. Is the test actually measuring what it is supposed to be measuring? That is what we mean by validity. And many of these tests, especially the internet-based tests, they are not actually valid. They may have the appearance of measuring personality traits, but they actually aren't measuring personality traits. Like the test picture that I have here, right? It just is measuring your color preferences. Let's say you love violet, then you will choose one, right? That does not mean anything else. Let's say you love rainbow color, you may choose 3 or whatever, right? So it is testing your color preferences. It is not testing your personality traits. Now, in here, we may see a consistent pattern. So today you are saying you love violet, or option A, option 1. 2 months from now, you may still choose option 1. So this test may be reliable, but it is not valid. It is not actually measuring your personality trait. It is measuring your color preferences or design preferences, depending on whether you like arches or squares or whatever, right? So tests may have the appearance of being valid when they actually aren't. And as I said, this applies not just to psychological tests, but to other tests as well. My watch here, the smartwatch, it for example gives me results about the quality of the sleep that I had uh, last night, okay, or every night. It tells me how much time I spent in my REM phase, in my light stage of sleep, and deep stages of sleep. Is that valid measure of my sleep quality? Now it is getting more valid, but you realize the real valid measure of my sleep quality, or the time that I spend in different stages of sleep, can only be measured by putting electrodes in my head, which will see the wave patterns, and from that only can we measure the actual time that I spent in different stages of sleep, right? This is getting more valid because researchers have found those correlations between the body movement and your heart rate with different stages of sleep. So from using complex algorithms, they try to estimate the amount of time that I spent in different stages of sleep, but it is still not as valid a measure of my sleep quality as would be putting those electrodes and seeing the wave patterns, right? So reliability, validity, again, this can be these are something that can range. So it's not that that test is either reliable or unreliable, either valid or not valid. Um, it can fall within a spectrum. Something can be more reliable, something can be less reliable. Using water to measure the length of any particular that is much more unreliable than the rubber band, right? Okay. So you realize, so um, reliability, validity range um, over a spectrum, and we want tests to be more reliable and more valid. The greater the reliability, the greater the validity of the test, the more we can trust the results of those tests. There will always be error. That is the reason I said there is always a range. It is not that, either it is reliable or it is unreliable. And of course, if it is really unreliable, then we will not call it reliable. But typically, it falls over a spectrum, over a range. So those are things to keep in mind whenever you are taking any test. Now we will discuss some examples of popularly known tests and whether they are reliable and valid. That's what we will talk about next. You may have seen people or heard people describing themselves in form of letters. Oh, I am an ESFP, or I am an INTJ. You may have yourself taken this test. It's from the MBTI, or Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, MBTI. It's probably the most popular personality test. But is it a reliable test? Is it a valid test? On the internet, you will see all kinds of, great, interesting profiles on the MBTI. But the MBTI essentially has four different categories: extroversion versus introversion, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, judging versus perceiving. And then, so if you take permutation combination, we ultimately have 16 combinations. So we end up with 16 combinations. And people get classified into different personality types. As you see here, some famous people uh, shown to be having different personality combinations or different personality types. Now, these people may not actually have taken the MBTI test, but based on what we know about them from their biographies or from their autobiographies, or based on how they have been depicted in the news, we can estimate probably this would be their personality trait combination. But the problem is that this MBTI test is not reliable. It has poor reliability and poor validity on both accounts. It falls short. That is the reason we do not actually use the MBTI, even though it is extremely popular, and many organizations, business organizations, use it in leadership development programs. But researchers, or people who are trained in personality psychology, they typically will not use the MBTI. Now, let me give you an example of why this is a problematic test. Remember, this is MBTI, Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. So you are always either, if I take one of those dimensions, either an extroverted person or an introverted person. That is, it's not like you are on a spectrum. Okay, you are more extroverted or less or more introverted. We don't talk about um, a range there. We talk about you falling either into the extroverted type or into the introverted type. There is no medium here. Okay. So imagine you take the MBTI test, and on the extroversion introversion dimension, you got 51, okay, on a scale of 100 to 0 to 100. So then you got classified as an extroverted person. And when you get classified as an extroverted person, and depending on how you got classified on the other dimensions, you would fall under one of these categories, right? But a month from now, when you retake the test, this time you didn't get 51, but you got a score of 49. And it is possible because it is just a couple of points different, right? Just there is always some margin of error in any test. So next time you get 49, where do you get classified? You get classified as an introverted person now. So your type changes dramatically to a different category. It may be ISTJ. So let's say you were ESTJ before, now you're ISTJ. Or you were whatever, ENFP before, now you are INFP. You're getting the point, right? Your type has changed dramatically, which means then we cannot rely on the results of this test. So what tests can you rely on? What test can you trust? The Big Five personality test inventory is something that we trust a lot because it has been validated. It's a complex scientific process to validate any particular test, and it has gone through that rigor. And we now know that the standardized tests of Big Five personality test is something that is much more reliable and has strong reliability and strong validity. That is the reason we trust the results of those tests. Now, of course, there are multiple versions of the Big Five personality tests. There is a 300 item version, there is a 40 odd items version, there is a 10 item version. Now you can realize the version that has only 10 items will not be as reliable or as valid as the 300 item test, right? Nonetheless, and the most commonly used version is the 40 odd item version. But you realize we um, trust the results from the Big Five personality tests more, not the MBTI, even though it is a popular test. So, but we will talk about the Big Five personality traits and its connection with leadership in the next video. Okay, so now we know what personality traits are, how they are measured, and what factors we need to keep in mind when we are measuring personality traits or when we are taking any personality tests. That's all fine. But the moot question is, do personality traits matter in case of leadership? Are there certain personality traits that are more strongly associated with leadership? It turns out the answer is yes. Yes, yes, and yes. It works the same way that our physical attributes matter as well. A tall person, everything else being constant, would be perceived to be more leader-like than a shorter person. There are, several studies that show this. Something that you will be able to relate to. In the US presidential election, for example, about 80 to 85% of the time, it is the taller candidate that has won the election, that has become the president. So that's a significant advantage than if you are a tall individual. By the way, it does not mean that you cannot be a leader if you are a shorter person, but certain physical as well as psychological attributes are perceived to be more leader-like. And remember, we had talked about emergent leadership. So if you have those traits, either physical traits or psychological traits, more people will be willing to follow you. Consequently, you are more likely to emerge as a leader in an informal situation. Then there is also research that has been done. This is more, modern research on personality traits, from which we know there are certain personality traits that are associated with being more effective in the role of leadership. So yes, it turns out that personality traits do matter a lot when it comes to leadership. Now, personality traits are not the only factors that influence leadership. There are other factors as well. There are factors outside a person that also influence the person's behavior. So this can be understood well if we study the interactionist perspective. When we are talking about the interactionist perspective, we recognize that personality influences a person's behavior, but so does the situation. Now, when a person's personality and the situational demands are in alignment, then it is easy to predict how the person is going to behave. For example, if I am an extroverted individual, highly extroverted individual, who are people who love to talk and they are gregarious individuals, they want to interact, have fun, chat. If I'm such a person, and the situation that I am in is at a party, then it is very easy to predict how I'm going to behave, right? My personality pulls me in the direction of chatting and talking and interacting with people. The situation that I am in also expects me to behave in that manner. So it becomes easy to predict how I'm going to behave in that situation. But when the person's personality is pulling you or pulling the person in one direction and the situation is pulling in another direction, then it becomes a little difficult to predict, right? Because both person and the situation influence people's actual behavior. The same example of the extroverted individual. If the person is alone, how is this person going to behave? Now that becomes a little difficult to predict because the person's personality is pulling in the direction of social interaction, whereas the person is in a situation where he doesn't have that opportunity. So how is this person going to behave? Well, it becomes difficult, but the interactionist perspective tells us that, well, it depends on whether the personality is strong or whether the situation is strong. So if my personality is so strong that it overpowers the strength of the situation, then my personality will dominate my behavior or will strongly influence my behavior. So if I am this super strongly extroverted individual and I'm alone, I may not be able to bear with 3 minutes of being alone, and I may start pulling out my cell phone and start calling my friends and chatting with them. Okay. Whereas if the situation is strong, the strength of the situation is stronger than the strength of the personality, then the situation may determine how I will behave, not my personality. Let's say I am extroverted, but not as strongly extroverted and a person. Let's say the situation is such that I am at a um, um, I am at a place where there is no cellular connectivity either. Okay, uh, now it becomes a little easier to predict how I'm going to behave. Maybe because there is no opportunity for me to interact with people, plus I'm not as strongly an extroverted individual, I may just decide to sit quietly in my chair and pontificate about things, right? So this is the interactionist perspective. If we talk about the interactionist perspective in context of leadership, the person's the leader's personality influences leadership behavior and ultimately leadership effectiveness. But remember that it's not just the personality traits that influence leadership effectiveness. There are other factors as well: situational factors, cultural factors, economic factors, even the nature of the followers. All those factors influence leadership effectiveness. But it is a fact that personality of the leader is one of the strong influencers of leadership effectiveness. I have already touched upon leadership emergence, so I won't spend too much time here. But the key point to remember is that people's personality traits influence leadership emergence. In other words, who is going to emerge as a leader? They influence very strongly personality traits. Personality traits also influence leadership effectiveness. Whether or not you will be effective as a leader, that is also influenced by your traits. But this relationship is not as strong. This relationship between effectiveness, leadership effectiveness, and personality traits is not as strong as the relationship is between leadership emergence and personality traits. Okay, and you can understand why. There are many factors that come into play when it comes to effectiveness, whether or not you will achieve the goals of the organization. Whole host of factors can come into play there, right? extraneous factors. But emergence, whether or not other people will perceive you to have leader-like qualities and whether or not they will be willing to follow you, will be more heavily influenced by your personality traits. And that is the reason uh, personality traits have a stronger relationship with leadership emergence. Now we will make a transition into the connection between personality traits and leadership. As I have already mentioned in the initial part of my video, personality traits is the oldest line of research in leadership. It began way back in the early 1900s. And those initial thoughts and that line of research was actually called the great man theories of leadership. Essentially, the researchers then were interested in finding out the, the traits that made great leaders great. Great leaders like Abraham Lincoln or Alexander the Great or Napoleon or Mahatma Gandhi. They are all great leaders. But what is it that made them great? What traits did they have that made them great? Those were the kind of questions that researchers were asking then. And this was a very prolific line of research until, I would say, the 1950s. But by the time researchers reached 1950s, they had become very disillusioned with this line of research to the extent that they gave up this line of research. Why? Because they were not finding any common traits across all these great leaders. So there were many traits that were showing up. Each leader was great in his or her own unique way. So a different set of traits showed up every time. That is the reason this was not being a fruitful line of research until much later, when through the development of different statistical techniques, uh, we now have identified some major individual characteristics that is associated with leadership. And that's what we will discuss next. Here are the 5 major leadership traits, or the traits that are most strongly associated with you being perceived as a leader. The emphasis here is on being perceived as a leader, meaning other people will view you as a leader if you are intelligent, if you are confident, if you are determined and have high integrity and are very social. If you have these qualities, then you are more likely to be perceived by others as a leader or as a person with leader-like qualities. And consequently, people will be willing to follow you, which is nothing but leadership emergence. So there are certain personality traits that are associated with you emerging as a leader. Now, strictly speaking, some of these factors are not traits. Intelligence, for example, is not a personality trait. It is more an ability, an intellectual ability, right? Um, let's, in fact, start our discussion with intelligence. Of course, we have seen many people, uh, many leaders who are extremely intelligent. So we currently have Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs was again very intelligent. We have the perception of they being very intelligent individuals, and they reached these top leadership positions. Um, so when we talk about intelligence, uh, we talk about IQ scores, right? 100 is considered average. If you have an IQ score of 100, that is considered average. If you have a score of 115, you are more than 50 plus 34. So 84.1% of the population. Your IQ is more than 84.1% of the population. If you have an IQ of 130, your IQ is more than what? 97.8% of the population. So that is super high. You are very high on your intelligence then. If your IQ is 85, well, you are only say about 15% or 16%. Your IQ is more than 16% of the population, and so on and so forth. So that's what this bell curve shows. Now, why am I showing you this? Because I'm going to share you some of the results of the research studies that have been done on the intelligence of the presidents of United States. This graph that you see here shows the different IQs of or estimated IQs of different American presidents. Not their exact IQs, because of course not everyone here must have been tested on IQ tests. But researchers using different complex methodologies, which we won't go into here, have been able to estimate the IQs of different presidents. And of course, the person with highest IQ has a very high score of 168.75, J.Q. Adams. But even the person with lowest IQ amongst the presidents, Grant, had an IQ of 120. By the way, this is actually not as accurate data, because these are uncorrected scores. If you look at the original study from which these people drew this graph, J.Q. Adams's corrected IQ scores was actually 175, and after the statistically correct for certain factors, it was 175, and the least intelligent Grant's IQ was 130. That is more than what? 85, 84% of the population. So intelligence then becomes a great predictor of whether you will be perceived as a leader, whether or not you will become a leader. And you can realize why intelligence matters, because leaders have to make decisions. They have to take decisions which require complex problem solving abilities. And the more intelligent you are, the better you will be at solving problems and taking those making those complex decisions, right? So intelligence does matter a lot. And people also are much more willing to follow a person who is more intelligent. Now, this does not mean that high intelligence is always going to be helpful in leadership positions. In fact, there is evidence that in certain situations, high IQ may not come of much use to you in enhancing your performance. This is explained well in the cognitive resource theory. So intelligence, according to this theory, is considered like a resource. Money, for example, is a resource, right? Raw materials are resources. So let's take the example of money. Let's say you have a lot of money in your account, but if there is a freeze on your account, even if you have that money, you will not be able to withdraw, and you will not be able to make use of that money if the government has put a freeze on your account, right? Same thing happens with respect to intelligence. Intelligence is just the capacity. It gives you the capability to solve problems. It gives you the capability to solve complex problems. But if you are highly stressed, under low stress, of course, the more the intelligence, the higher the performance. But if the stress level goes too high, then we can see that your performance starts declining, even if you are a person with high intelligence, because you are not being able to access that intelligence. you are so emotionally involved, you're so emotionally distressed that you are not being able to think clearly, and consequently you make erroneous decisions, which ultimately leads to poorer performance. So intelligence then can be seen as a resource. Now, in contrast to the high IQ leaders, an experienced leader, somebody who has had the experience of dealing with similar stressful situations, will actually be able to perform high in those stressful situations, right? Because this person has dealt with similar stressful situations in the past. So he or she will be able to make use of the experience that he has had and be able to perform well. So that's the cognitive resource theory. It gives you some insights about how intelligence then can cease to be an asset in certain conditions, unless, of course, you succeed in managing yourselves well in high stressful conditions. I have some uh, write-up description here about the cognitive resource theory, exactly what I just mentioned. So I won't spend time here. You can read it up yourself, and I will proceed to the next slide. So now that we have finished our discussion on intelligence, let's go to the next one, self-confidence. Self-confidence is a big predictor of whether or not you will be perceived as a leader. In fact, when I was talking about the great man theories of leadership and how they were not finding any traits common across all the great leaders due to which they were getting disillusioned, there was one trait though that um, occurred more frequently than any other traits, and that was self-confidence. So self-confidence turns out to be a strong predictor of whether or not you will be perceived as a leader. Most leaders that you can think of often tend to be very confident individuals. Now, there will be exceptions to these rules, which we will discuss in context of other theories, but actually maybe even in context of the trait theory later on. But self-confidence generally is a great predictor, because you see, no one likes to follow somebody who doesn't appear to be confident. Imagine I am lost in a city. I'm in a new town. I'm lost there, and I am seeking directions from some strangers. I ask person for the first person that I meet, hey, can you help me find the direction to whatever XYZ office? And the person thinks and tells me in a very unsure way, maybe you should go straight on this road and turn right at the second left, or no, maybe third left, uh, and maybe you should find it there. Okay. Now contrast such a response with somebody else. When I ask the same question, the person says very confidently, oh, XYZ office. Oh, yeah, I know. Oh, just go straight and then take the fourth turn and make a right turn there. And if you walk 10 yards, you will see the XYZ office there. Now, which person am I going to follow? Obviously the second person, right? Because this person seems to be saying things very confidently. Now it is possible that the second person is giving me completely wrong directions and the first person was giving me the correct directions. But because the second person spoke so confidently, I'm much more likely to follow this person's directions, right? So I'm going to be more likely to be influenced by this second person. So that's, I think, a good illustration of how much self-confidence matters when it comes to leadership, when it comes to you being able to influence people. The next factor is determination. You see, this turns out to be a very important factor as well, because doesn't matter how talented you are, doesn't matter how intelligent you are or self-confident you are, uh, you will receive failures. not just in your personal sphere, but professionally, and especially when you are trying to lead a larger group of people, you will receive setbacks. You will come across major hurdles. So people who are determined only continue to persist despite those setbacks, despite those problems, despite those hurdles. Um, they don't give up very easily. And most common folks give up during those difficult circumstances. And that is the reason determination becomes a great predictor of whether or not you will be a great leader. It's what would separate the small time leaders from great leaders, right? You can see how this makes sense. So, for example, here there is the example of Nelson Mandela, who was in jail for I believe 27 years, if I remember correctly. So imagine, you being jailed for 27 days, and we will become gloomy, we will give up on life, or just couple of days. Uh, this person was in jail for 27 years. He could have easily lost hope of ever being able to uh, fight for his nation against apartheid. But he never gave up. He continued to fight from the jail, right? So that shows determination. We give up very easily, but people who end up being great leaders are extremely determined individuals. The next factor is integrity, and you can realize why that matters a lot. Because people who have high integrity, we can trust these leaders. You can imagine a person who lacks integrity, then we will not trust this person. Or at least once we realize that this person lacks integrity, we will not trust this person anymore. Consequently, we will not be willing to follow this person, because this person could harm us, could harm others. But if we believe that a person has high integrity, we will be willing to follow this person, maybe even till our death. Mahatma Gandhi, for instance, had a strong reputation of being a person of high integrity, and that helped him a lot when he was leading India towards its independence. If you have seen the movie Gandhi, there is a great scene there in which, during the Satyagraha, where Gandhi and Gandhi's followers. Gandhi was actually not present at that point of time because he had been jailed, but his followers, following Gandhi's precepts, were protesting against the Britishers, but very peacefully. They had determined not to take up arms. And the British soldiers and the Indian soldiers who were working under the Britishers, there is this great scene where these people who are protesting, they walk up to these policemen and without protesting, and these policemen, they beat them up, they fracture their skulls, these people start bleeding, and then there will be these women folks that carry them away, and the second line of protesters will reach the cops, and the cops will beat them down, break their bones, fracture their skulls. They will be taken away, and this goes on and on and on for several hours. I mean, the movie tells that it uh, goes on deep into the night. Of course, the scene lasts for a minute or two. Now, imagine the kind of influence that Gandhi had on these people. He could have this kind of influence because people believed in Gandhi completely, right? And because of his integrity, because of his reputation of being a person of high integrity, people were ready to take such extreme measures where they are ready to be killed. Now, it's one thing to run towards an enemy while you are being fired and while you are having a gun in your hand, while you are firing. You do a lot of those stuff in the heat of the moment. But walking peacefully, knowing that you will have your bones broken, you will have your skulls fractured, uh, that requires a lot of courage. And that was, of course, possible because of these people being led by, a person like Gandhi, who had the reputation of being a person of high integrity. Anyway, the last one is sociability. And so how inclined you are towards interacting with people. Are you a social person? Are you a loner? uh, you see, how did we define leadership? We defined leadership as the process of influencing others to attain some common goal. How can you influence others if you are not willing to interact with them? Now, if you are a loner, then of course you will be at a major disadvantage when it comes to leading. So people who are highly sociable, they then have an edge over people who are less sociable when it comes to leadership, because influence can happen only through interactions, and only when you interact with people will you be able to influence them. So this is where we will stop. These are the 5 major traits that have been identified to be associated with leadership emergence. In the next video, I will talk about the big 5 personality traits and how those traits relate with leadership.